How did Jesus ever come up with the idea for Christmas? How did he ever come to believe that he could be God in human form, God in the flesh, God incarnate? I've talked before about how impossible, how utterly impossible that would have been for his disciples. The only thing that got them to that belief was after his crucifixion, their belief that he was appearing to them risen from the dead. And in those appearances, it wasn't just that he was appearing risen from the dead, he was appearing in a way that he seemed to them clothed in divine-like glory. That's the only thing that could catapult them out of the limitations, the horizon, the intellectual horizon of their first century, fiercely monotheistic Jewish worldview. But Jesus was a first century, fiercely monotheistic Jew also. He had that same worldview. So before his resurrection, prior to the resurrection, how did he ever come up with the idea that he was God incarnate? How did he ever come up with the idea for Christmas? We know that he did. Mark 13:32 is a perfect example of this. I've talked about it before in a different context when talking about the end time. In fact, that's Jesus' focus in that verse when he's talking about his return. He says, of that day or hour, nobody knows, neither the angels nor the Son nor the Father. It's an amazing verse because Jesus there is admitting ignorance of the end time, something you would think if he is God, he would know. It's such an embarrassing verse that we know, even the most skeptical reader of the Gospels can know, that this was something that Jesus said. That's not in doubt. But look at what he says almost in a matter-of-fact way, because again, this is not the focus of the verse. This is not what he's thinking about. Think about what he just says there in that verse about his identity when he's talking about a completely different subject. He talks about himself as the Son of the Father. Scholars will point out that that absolute use of those two terms, the Son, the Father, means that he's thinking of himself as somehow ontologically related to the Father. So kind of like with a human father and human son, they're kind of made of the same stuff, the same genetic stuff, the same DNA. What Jesus is saying there is, I'm made of the same substance. I'm of the same being, the same identity as God the Father. In other words, I'm divine. And if that isn't plain enough for us to see that he's admitting a divine self-awareness, a divine identity as the eternal Son, look at where he positions himself, because the scholars will also point out that the only position above the angels was the abode of God. Jesus positions himself above the angels, between the angels and the Father. But the only thing above the angels in Jewish cosmology is the abode of God. It was used euphemistically that way when you talked about something being higher than the angels. It was a way of referring to God. So how did Jesus ever get the idea that he was the eternal Son of God? You may be wondering at this point why I'm not using more explicit statements of Jesus to that effect, like John 8:58, which may be the most explicit, where he uses the divine name, I am, what God, Yahweh, reveals to Moses in the burning bush. The reason I'm not using that is because many skeptical scholars will deny that Jesus actually said those words. They think that the gospel writer, John, or his sources put those words into Jesus' mouth. If you want more information on that, some of the arguments back and forth, and some more in-depth analysis, go to the written blog. I have more on that there. But for now, let me say this. I don't need to use those more explicit statements because something like Mark 13:32 proves that Jesus had that divine self-awareness. And it's a verse that virtually everybody, even the most skeptical reader of the Gospels, can accept as the words of Jesus. By the criterion of embarrassment, we know Jesus said that. And so we know Jesus, at least in his mind, understood himself to be the eternal Son. So how did Jesus ever come up with this idea for Christmas? Could he have gotten it from the surrounding cultures? At the time, Israel, Palestine, Judaism was surrounded by pagan cultures. And within paganism, the idea of apotheosis was in the air. Apotheosis is a technical term talking about the divinization of human beings. In other words, there are all kinds of ideas floating around in paganism of gods becoming human and humans being gods. Even some of the emperors claimed to be God. Could Jesus have gotten it from that, borrowed it from that? Well, one of the things that has really come to light in the past 3 decades through scholarship, through some of the most recent findings, is that for first century Jews like Jesus, not only was somebody claiming to be a god, a human being claiming to be a god, or God that claimed that God could become human, something that they would see as blasphemous, start picking up stones to put somebody to death that deserved capital punishment, that they would become irate over. But before they ever got angry over that, they'd have to pick themselves up off the ground because they would have found it utterly ridiculous. That's what some of the newer research is showing. It would have been laughable. They couldn't entertain it seriously. So they certainly would have been deeply offended, abhorred by it. But before they got there, they would have found it absolutely ludicrous. A great example of this is Philo of Alexandria. Philo is considered one of the greatest Jewish philosophers, especially around the time of Jesus. He's a rough contemporary of Jesus. Philo was living in Alexandria, which is Greco-Roman territory, because he's part of what's known as the Jewish diaspora. So Jesus is living primarily among Jews in Palestine, but Philo is like surrounded, inundated by pagans, and he is steeped in Greco-Roman culture and thought, philosophy, because he's very interested in it. His whole life project was to try to show how Jewish thought would be appealing to Greco-Roman philosophy. He loved Greco-Roman philosophy, admired the philosophers, and wanted to kind of translate Judaism so that people would find it appealing. People who had that way of thinking would find it appealing. So he knew that kind of philosophy, that worldview, what apotheosis constituted, as well as any Jew of his day did. And yet, when Gaius Caligula, the emperor at the time, claims to be divine, God, a Lord, this is how Philo responds. It's classic. He says, "Sooner could God change into a man than a man could change into a god." What he's saying to Caligula is that is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard, because the most ridiculous thing there is the idea that God could change into a man. But at least he's God. He can do the impossible. You, Caligula, you're just a man. You can't. So if you're thinking that you could somehow cross that gap between the divine and human is utterly ridiculous. In other words, follow his logic. What he's saying here is that God, who can do all things, even one thing God can't do is violate his nature, his rational nature. And it is his rational nature that the infinite God can't become finite. The creator can't become created. So Philo, when he's looking for the most ridiculous example he can find to kind of shame Caligula, the most ridiculous example he can find is the idea of an incarnation, that God could become human. That's how utterly ridiculous, how ludicrous it would have seemed to a first century Jew, including Jesus. So how did Jesus ever come up with the idea for Christmas? Could he have gotten it in some of the writings that were current in his time, some of the fringe writings within Judaism that scholars sometimes point to? Well, let me use, and again, the written blog has some more detail on this, let me use the most compelling example scholars have proffered, because if it applies to this, it will apply to all the others, the lesser ones. It's from a category they've termed divine agency, and the example is Enoch of Genesis fame, the Enoch in Genesis 5 who kind of appears and then disappears quickly. And when he disappears, it's kind of mysterious. It's like God takes him just up into heaven, like he's assumed into heaven. Because of that, over the centuries after that, Genesis, the Jewish writers, different Jewish writings, speculate about what that could have meant. By roughly the time of Jesus, the parables of Enoch, there are 3 books of parables written sometime between the 1st century BC and 2nd century AD, so they're roughly around the time of Jesus. Take up that story of Enoch again and do some more speculating. The key passages are 2 heavenly scenes in these books of parables that probably most scholars think were written after the time of Jesus. But what they say is they give us an idea of what it would be possible for a first century Jew to think. And so in these heavenly scenes, these heavenly visions, Enoch is depicted standing at the right side of God, executing judgment against Israel's enemies. He seems to be exercising a divine prerogative. But if you look closely at the text, as many scholars have now, what you actually see is that he's not sitting at the right side of God, on God's throne. He's standing the way that the angels stand in service in God's presence. You see that his role is limited to performing a divine function, a prerogative, God's judgment, and it's limited to a small group of people, Israel's enemies. And the only time that Enoch actually sits on the throne of God, it's Gabriel who invites him there to sit on the left side of God. The right side was seen as kind of like the power side of God. He sits on the left so that God can kind of show him, unveil to him God's perspective of heaven and earth. And that, again, that also is for a very limited time. So Enoch is not being presented as having a divine identity, somehow being God in some way, and therefore being at the right hand of God. He's seen as performing a divine function in service of God. In fact, this is what scholars in the past 3 decades have unveiled, is that when Jewish people at the time were looking around at all the monarchies around them, the more a monarch delegated their authority, in other words, the less they had to get their hands dirty in administrating their kingdom, their reign, the greater they were perceived. So monarchs would often delegate a lot of their authority to other people, but that only elevated them in people's eyes. So what scholars are thinking is that these Jewish writings are trying to magnify Yahweh by saying the sovereign, the monarch of the universe, doesn't need to do these things. He can delegate. He's so great, he can delegate them to others. He doesn't have to get his hands dirty in the administration of his reign, of his kingdom. So then the effect of books like Enoch and all the other examples of divine agents or divine agency scholars have found, and some other things similar to that, the net effect of that is only to intensify monotheism by Jesus' day. In other words, it was only more unthinkable that somebody could bridge that chasm between the divine and the human. So how did Jesus ever come up with the idea that he was God incarnate? How did he ever come up with the idea for Christmas? Could he have possibly gotten it within? Maybe if he didn't get it from outside sources, Jewish or pagan, could he have thought it up himself? Could he have been that deluded, for example, that much of a lunatic to think that he was God? Or could he have been that much of an egomaniac, a megalomaniac, that arrogant, that audacious? Well, if you look at people who are that deluded and or egomaniacal, somebody like David Koresh, who may be the best recent, in living memory, best recent example, and compare the two, it's very, very eye-opening. So David Koresh, if you don't know, was the leader of the Branch Davidians, kind of a cult. He's a typical cult leader. That's why I'm using him as a great example of this. And again, I have much more detail on this in the written blog. But as a typical cult leader, he provides a good contrast between Jesus, because David Koresh, leader of the Branch Davidians, which had a famous months-long standoff with the ATF and FBI that ended very badly, David Koresh used his women followers to indulge his sexual appetite. He used his male followers to defend him, to even kill and die for him, while he stood back in safety as kind of a gutless coward. Jesus, on the other hand, came not to be served, but to serve, and gave his life as a ransom for others, believing that he was dying in order to save them. Whatever you believe about the truth of that statement, that was certainly his understanding and the understanding of those around him. So if you just look at the character of Jesus versus David Koresh as a typical cult leader, you see a wild contrast. Jesus is the furthest thing from a cult leader, an egomaniac, megalomaniac. In fact, many people, even many non-believers, think that he is one of, if not the most altruistic, selfless people who have ever lived, a quintessential man for others. And it's not just his character. As I've said before, the psychiatrist James T. Fisher is one of a number who point out that this is the way he puts it, if you take all the journals of psychologists and psychiatrists, all the combined wisdom, and put it all together, all the combined wisdom they have on mental hygiene, and then you have the best of the living poets kind of go through it, edit it for excess verbiage, he says you would have a very awkward and incomplete version of the Sermon on the Mount. Rodney Stark, who I've also mentioned before, and other sociologists like him, are doing a lot of research studies that are showing that when people actually follow Jesus' ethic, the Christian ethic, believers who actually try to live it out, that it leads to greater psychological health. By all measures, not only was Jesus one of the most altruistic, selfless people, not an egomaniac or megalomaniac, but he was also the most sane. He wasn't deluded or lunatic at all. He may have been the most sane person to ever have lived. So how did Jesus ever come up with the idea for Christmas? If I was to answer this a number of years ago, I would just attribute it to his religious genius. He was such a religious genius in everything else, from his concept of God and God's radical grace to his counterintuitive ethic, love your enemy, turn the other cheek, to just the way he would constantly blow up taboos, push boundaries, overturn conventions. Everything he did reflected a religious genius. So it would be just like him to come up with something like this, with a self-awareness like this. But the more I've discovered, the more I've studied first century monotheistic Judaism, the more I realize how impossible that would be. That for a first century monotheistic Jew, even the greatest of religious geniuses, you could never overcome the hurdle of the logical impossibility God becoming human presents. It's the modern equivalent for us of taking the ocean and putting it in a bottle. Impossible. Or of picturing a square circle. Impossible. No matter how great a religious genius Jesus might have been, he never could have imagined himself in an ordinary, natural way, coming to the understanding of himself as God, as divine, as the eternal Son of God in human form. So how did Jesus come up with the idea for Christmas? The leading scholar in this area has talked about how for Jesus' disciples, the only way that they could come to believe he was Lord is if they experienced something with the relative revelatory force, validity and force significant enough to reconfigure monotheism. Think about that word, reconfigure. It means like change things all around, to totally blow up their worldview the way it did. The only thing that could have done that is something that had that kind of revelatory validity, a revelation that they could trust was really true from God, and had that kind of force that could push them, force them to think something that up to that point was utterly unthinkable. And again, he goes back to the idea, this leading scholar, that the only thing that could do that was seeing Jesus risen from the dead, clothed in divine-like glory. So for Jesus, prior to the resurrection, there's no way to explain how he could understand himself to be the eternal Son of God in naturalistic ways, in ordinary ways. The only way to explain it is as some kind of supernatural insight, as something either he had in himself all along because he is the eternal Son of God who's very aware of his identity, or something that was revealed to him by God the Father, his true Father, which also means he is God the Son. And so if the only way to explain him having this understanding is as some kind of supernatural insight, it means that he actually is the eternal Son. How did Jesus ever come up with the idea for Christmas? Well, we may not know specifically. Maybe Mary and Joseph sat him down as a young boy and explained the circumstances of his birth, the miraculous circumstances. Maybe it was just an intuition he had all along. Maybe there was a moment in time where he had some kind of revelation, like right before he goes into the temple and talks to the leaders and calls the temple his Father's house, meaning God the Father. We can't say for sure. Raymond Brown, the top biblical scholar of the last third of the past century, has posed a very intriguing question. He asked this question: where did Jesus get the assurance, that confidence that God was his Abba, his daddy? Where did he get the assurance to teach with such authority? One of the easiest ways to explain that is the virgin birth, is that Mary and Joseph did indeed sit him down at some point and explain to him what happened. But we can't say for sure. All we can say for sure is that this was Jesus' self-awareness, and that there's no ordinary naturalistic way to explain it, which it means it had to come through a supernatural insight, which means he had to be the eternal Son of God. Creedence Clearwater Revival in the late 1960s did a song that I think was titled Fortunate Son, or maybe Fortunate One. But the lyric that I remember so well was, I ain't no senator's son. That was like a bitter sarcasm, talking about the gross injustice of the fact, it was the time of the Vietnam War, that many people who were senators' sons, or had that kind of privilege in our society, were getting out of going to Vietnam. They were somehow being able to avoid the draft. Where so many other people who didn't have that privilege were being drafted, sent over to Vietnam in droves, and dying in droves. John McCain was Senator McCain, who died not too long ago, a couple of years ago. John McCain, his grandfather was an admiral in the Navy, and so was his father. So he was destined for a military career. When he went into the military, he chose to become a naval fighter pilot. And it was around the time of Vietnam. If anybody had privilege, especially when it came to the military, especially when it would come to getting assigned some nice, plush, cushy assignment far away from Vietnam, it was John McCain. But he never pulled that hook. Instead, he chose to go to Vietnam and to fly some very dangerous missions over Vietnam. So dangerous, in fact, as many of you know, he was shot down and he was held in a prison camp. He was a prisoner of war for many years, basically the rest of the war, from his time when he went in the late 60s to the rest of the war. He was held in a prison camp that his fellow prisoners ironically called the Hanoi Hilton. At the Hanoi Hilton, he, along with his other fellow prisoners, were tortured mercilessly. One of the things that they did to McCain over and over again was they broke his arms, just tore his arms out of shoulders. They tore his arms out of his shoulders, broke the sockets, broke everything over and over again. When he became a senator and then would run for president, he made numerous public appearances, and it was you were painfully aware of the fact that he had been tortured that way, because he held his arms in such an awkward way. He could never, from that experience, ever raise his arms above his shoulders again. He bore the scars of that experience. You may not like or have liked John McCain's politics, but one thing nobody can question is his love for this country. The fact that he gave up that privilege that he had, that he could have invoked to play it safe, to avoid Vietnam. The fact that he gave that up in order to fight in Vietnam and to fly these very dangerous missions, and then suffered so much, and then would bear the scars of that experience, of what he had done, what he had sacrificed for this country, left no doubt about his patriotism, left no doubt about his love for this country on an infinitely greater scale. That's what Christmas is all about. The eternal Son of God, who we know, we really know, has come in Jesus. The eternal Son of God gave up all the privilege of heaven, the greatest privilege of all. He was the Son of the Father. If anybody had a hook, he had it. If anybody can invoke privilege, he had it. But instead, he gave all that up to enter into this world, to go on a very dangerous mission that he knew absolutely going on that mission. It wasn't even a risk for him. He just knew he was going to experience excruciating torture at the end of his life. But he did all of that to save us. That's how precious we are to him. And then think about this. This will blow your mind. Then, now, for all eternity, he bears the scars of that experience. He continues to bear the scars of the torture that he endured for us. And that leaves no doubt about his love for us. If this Christmas you are wondering, is there a God up there who cares about me? If you're wondering, how does God feel about me? Think about what's really going on at Christmas. Think about what the eternal Son did in becoming flesh, incarnate, a human being like us, all with the mission, the point, to one day die on that cross to save us. That's how precious you are to him. That's how much he loves you. Merry Christmas.